So it is now after 2, so I'm going to begin. My name is Andrea Nash, and I am a HRPP protocol coordinator. I work within our Office for Human Protections. And today what we're going to be doing is covering regulations, what makes up an IRB protocol, and things and considerations of the different categories. So for those who are saying that you have very little to no experience, this is the presentation for you. Otherwise, it's going to be a good solid refresher. If you have questions at any point, feel free to post it to the chat. I typically run a very informal presentation, so I'm happy to answer questions then, or you're welcome to save them to the end. So, did our 2 polls. So when we're talking about the regulations, one thing we have to be careful of is be wary of retrospective moral judgment. This is where we judge the past with present eyes. And the reason why I'm going to bring this up is as we're going through the regulations, you're going to see that there's sizable time gaps between the different regulations themselves. And you're going to also notice that the regulations appear to be saying the same thing over and over and over. So what I've actually done is gone ahead and I highlight what is, or underlined what is new. So that way you can actually see what is the true new contents being brought. You're going to also notice that you're going to see a regulation and there's cases of non-compliance on the side. And it's as society was wrestling with itself of how is the best way to protect human subjects. So when starting off, we have to acknowledge that there is a dark side to research. We were part of the eugenics movement that was back in the 18 to 1900s. And what really got the research train going in the United States was syphilis and gonorrhea. This was a huge issue with World War I. This was the first major war that we were sending troops overseas, and why there were tremendous casualties and loss of just a sizable amount of life. The amount of life that was lost to syphilis and gonorrhea was through the roof. And you can see on the right-hand side, we have some posters trying to warn the general public. And there's, even if you go into that link later on, just listen to all the different propaganda that they're trying to use to warn the public. So the federal government got concerned about this and went ahead and threw money at it to try to find the cure, which started a huge range of syphilis and gonorrhea research. Well, after the end of World War II, we actually get our first regulation, and that's from the Nuremberg Code. Now, the Nuremberg Code was unique in several aspects. One, it was saying that you have to obtain consent. Consent must be voluntary. Individuals have the right to stop at any time. Furthermore, it's researchers' responsibility. They can't delegate the impunity of this. They have to be qualified in order, or medically, in order to be able to conduct research. They must stop. Your research cannot be random, cannot be unnecessary. You have to make efforts to avoid unnecessary suffering. And all of this was actually fairly novel. And it came out of the Nuremberg trials when they were trying the Nazi doctors. Picture this. You have rows in the courthouse. There's over 25 rows, and each row fit over 30 doctors. And they had days of these trials. The Nazi doctors looked at the United States and said, "How dare you judge us? You're doing eugenics research as well." And this is what came out with an international code. Now, if you look at the lower right-hand side, you're going to see that there is the STD Guatemala study. Dates from 1946 to 1948. This started because of that huge research trend that I was mentioning earlier. Interesting fact, it wasn't that long ago that President Obama actually apologized to the people of Guatemala for the United States involvement in this study. And what we have during this time that helps frame some of these codes is that this is an era where people were thought they need to put the group above the individual. And you're going to actually see when our society shifts, the regulations change in their tone. So in 1964, there's that shift. We have the Declaration of Helsinki. Notice that this doesn't cover research. It's only covering biomedical, medical, and clinical research treatments. And Declaration of Helsinki has some new things that it brings into it. Research must conform with general acceptable practices. Qualifications is no longer defined by medical. You also have to be qualified to do research itself. The importance that you're seeking to research has to be proportional to the risk that you're asking people to take, and hazards may never outweigh the benefits. So in the Nuremberg trials, your hazards just had to be equal with the benefits, but now they can't outweigh. Furthermore, now you have to be aware of possible coercion when consenting. So the Nuremberg Code went ahead and said consent will have to be voluntary. Here, it's going ahead and saying if it's not voluntary, it's not true consent. That's a biggie. And the Declaration of Helsinki is a very short read, and it really just sums down to this sentence at top. The interest of science and society should never take the precedence over considerations related to the well-being of the subject. And if you look, this is during the Civil War era, or Civil Rights era. So now we have the US Surgeon General's requirement of 1966. And this is the first time that we have research institutions being required to establish local policies for the protection of human subjects. So 1966, but we have the Stanford Prison Experiment in 1971, where students were at a college university and they were invited to take place in a simulation that had to be stopped roughly about 5 days later. And this is where individuals half the students were prison guards, half the students were prisoners. They had riots, they had strip searches. The study just lost control. And then you have the Tuskegee syphilis study that started during that syphilis and gonorrhea research and ran till 1973 when it was whistleblown on. And the thing with that study was that you had individuals going into no to low income areas, targeting people of color, basically not telling them that they're not being given a cure, but they're being given a placebo in order to watch the progression of syphilis. Later on, John Heller, who was the director of Vernal Disease Unit, was the one responsible for conducting Tuskegee syphilis study, came back and went to the outcry and was saying that men's status does not warrant ethical debate. They were subjects, not patients, clinical material, not sick people, which violates our prior regulation, the Declaration of Helsinki. The slides will be posted later on, yes. So during the outcry of 1973, and one thing we have to observe about our government is change usually does not implement quickly. Watch the progression of these dates. So in 1974, we have the National Research Act, which created a national commission for the protection of human subjects of biomedical and behavioral research. Behavioral research is now being included. And they were charged with going ahead and coming up with basic ethical principles, developing guidelines for people to follow, clarifying where boundaries were between research and medicine, coming up with criteria to figure out what is appropriate risk versus benefits, which is still a huge debate today, and truly tried to define what is informed consent. Furthermore, they require each entity to establish an institutional review board. This is an ethics committee that comes together to review protocols.
I finished my test. Okay. I finished my test.
So the result, though, that we had in this was the creation of the Belmont Report, formed on April 18th, 1974. And a little interesting historical fact, because I'm a history buff, Belmont Report was actually written on a bar napkin. And I had the privilege of hearing one of the original authors speak at a national convention. And he said that they had never planned for it to still be used all these years later. They thought they were just getting the ball rolling. So with the Belmont Report, it created the most important thing it went ahead and did was it came up with 3 major ethical principles: respect for persons, benefits, and justice. So we've seen respect for persons in the previous regulations, and same with benefits. Justice was the new one. Here, people have to think very carefully who is going to receive the benefits of research and who is going to have to bear its burdens. Furthermore, it's trying to maximize that everyone's getting an equal share. Everyone is getting what they need according to their individual needs, individual efforts, contributions, and merits. Regarding informed consent, we have the inclusion of individuals must have an opportunity to ask questions and withdraw from any time if they have concerns. Likewise, you have to declare a conflict of interest. Furthermore, you have the inclusion of, you have to include what is the time commitment, and you have to be holding it at an 8th grade reading level with your consent forms. Which brings up the point of, what about deception research? If you remember earlier, I mentioned that research has to be voluntary, there has to be full disclosure, but research that involves deception, you can't make a full disclosure because if you do, it alters what you're researching. So in the case of deception research, it actually requires individuals to go ahead after they complete a study. The research team has to go to those individuals and say, we apologized, we deceived you. This is why it was absolutely necessary for us to deceive you. Now, in full light of all the information, do you consent to allow us to use the information that you have given us? That's where the true consent process is taking place. And I absolutely adore this comic because it reads, I am so glad I caught you in. Let me reassure you, I'm not trying to sell you anything. I am doing my dissertation on the lived experiences of the living, and I just need 4 or 5 hours of your time to answer a few hundred questions. If you'll just sign this informed consent form, we'll begin. This is not what the founders have in mind when they're talking about informed consent. Too often, people will fall into a very common trap of thinking that informed consent is the signing of a document. It's not. It's a discussion, and it's a discussion that continues on after they have given their initial permission. So if you find any new information about the risks or the benefits or any kind of changes to your procedures, you have to have that continuing discussion with your participants. It's an ethical responsibility. The other thing that we have with the Belmont Report under assessment of risk and benefits is that we now are looking more closely at the selection of subjects. And we have the classification that there are vulnerable populations. And you're working with a vulnerable population, you need to demonstrate there's an appropriateness of why you're selecting them. We're not allowed to select research subjects out of mere convenience. So now we have a huge gap between changes. So we have the Belmont Report, and then the next thing we see is the Common Rule. And the Common Rule was implemented on June 18th, 1991. How it came about was that you had all these different institutions who had all these own policies. They incorporated the elements of the Belmont Report, but you have this huge variety of standards. So a bunch of the federal agencies got together and said, we need something standardized. So if anyone is wanting to receive federal funding, you have to acknowledge that that institution has to acknowledge that they're going to follow the Common Rule. And you have to acknowledge on your federal-wide insurance, either you're going to go ahead and require all protocols, regardless of funding source, to follow Common Rule, or are you going to only subject those that are seeking federal funds? And there's serious infractions for breaking 45 CFR 46, which is known as the Common Rule. You can lose funding to a project, and it's also possible to lose entire federal funding of the institution, and the institution then has to pay it back. Oh, skipped one. International Ethic Guidelines for Biomedical Research in 1982. This one went ahead and brought in strengthening the ability for ethical review at local and national levels, and also required sponsors to provide healthcare services. So this was the first time that sponsors were being required to have more of a say in the research besides looking at the initial proposal. So going back to 45 CFR. So 45 CFR went ahead and also required standards in a wide variety of areas. IRB records, membership, how they reviewed, having different review processes. We're going to cover those a little bit more later on. What's involved with reviewing at an institution, how suspension and termination of IRB approval would work, how does cooperative research work across different institutions, how are federal funds used, and so on. And just recently, we had the revised Common Rule be implemented. And so this is the first major revision to the Common Rule since 1991. And it affects all protocols reviewed after January 19th, 2019. So you might be looking at this and wait, Andrew, hold on. 2019, but the regulation says it's 2018. So what happened was the regulation was scheduled to take place on January 19, 2018. It got postponed 6 months, postponed again another 6 months, and it eventually took place on January 19, 2019, which is why it affects everything 2019 on and not 2018. And this had a fair number of changes, actually. So one, it went ahead and altered the definition of who is a human subject. And it now includes the definition of identifiable data and identifiable biospecimens. And now there's also an explicit definition involving clinical trials. There's also a lot of changes to the exempt categories. So when we're talking about the different categories under the old regulation, the old version of CFR, you had audio interviews that were audio recorded would have been classified as expedited or classified as exempt, which is the lowest risk category. Furthermore, you have the key information section and broad consent has been altered. So under the original Common Rule, a consent form didn't have a key information section. Now it does. And what the key information section does in the consent form is before you make someone, a prospect participant, read 5 to 6 pages, it's a short synopsis. So they can decide reading the short synopsis, is this even something they're likely to participate in? Individuals a chance to decide in there, are they going to opt in or opt out of having their identifiable data and leftover specimens be for future research? So before, The revised common rule, if you did not specifically tell individuals that you may use their data for future studies without their consent, you can do it. Now you have to go ahead and disclose that upfront, whether you're going to do that or not. It also changed the requirements for continuing reviews. So under the original common rule, continuing reviews were required for any expedited protocol. After, we have to provide justification of why this additional oversight is needed. There are also mandates for single IRB review when you have all federally funded cooperative research that involves more than one institution. And there are also changes to the waivers of the consent criteria and documentation. So what questions do you have on the regulations so far? And again, you'll have opportunity later to ask questions if you're still processing. I know I've just thrown a lot at you, but I want to just pause for a moment. Let's also do a temperature check. How are you feeling with the information that I just gave to you? 1, I'm lost. 10, I'm feeling really good. Just go ahead and post in the chat. Okay, so people seem to be feeling pretty good. For those who are giving me 6 and below, what will help you? Yeah, the test is likely to ask the difference between the regulations. I would pay attention to the underlines. And likewise, as you're studying for this test, because we still have more sections to go through, but as you're studying for it, if you have confusion, please, you're going to have my contact information. Absolutely feel free to reach out to me. I am more than happy to talk to you over your lunch hour. Okay. So for those who have put a 6 or lower, if there's a way I can help you further, feel free to, you can also private message me if you don't want a group message. So a presentation will be made available later on when it's all said and done. There will also be a summary of the key differences. You can do that by looking at where the underlines are. That's going to illustrate what is different between regulations across the different slides. And if you get an opportunity to go ahead and look at the regulations directly, all of them, with the exception of the common rule, are very short reads. You're talking a minimum of maybe 3 pages or maximum about 3 pages. So our next section is going to go ahead and cover the different groups, because I've known I've thrown a lot and I've started throwing some acronyms at you. So you have OHARP. This is the federal agency that oversees all of the IRBs. They're very nice people. They're part of the Department of Health and Human Services, and they have some requirements that's important to pay attention to. So every institution has to federal-wide insurance with them. So this is going back to saying, what do you agree to follow or not follow within the common rule? The agency OHARP actually mandates each institution has to either establish their own IRB, use an existing IRB, or use an approved commercial IRB for protocol review. And then OHARP also requires that institutions come up with a way to ensure regulatory compliance. So this can be through a post-approval monitoring program or by some other mechanism. Institutions are required to report to OHARP on several circumstances. It's mandate report if you are looking at unanticipated problems, continuing non-compliance. So this is where you had someone who messed up, you fixed it, you looked at them again, and they've messed up yet again. If you've had individuals who went ahead and have gotten the rating of serious non-compliance by the chair, a protocol has been suspended or even terminated by the IRB, then you have to go ahead and report to OHARP. This is a really useful little flowchart. So now let's take a closer look at what is the IRB. The IRB, when you talk about it at your institutions, is not the IRB office. That's a very common mistake people make. An IRB is a convened meeting of faculty peers. They have been charged with making sure individuals' human rights are being protected. They are responsible for reviewing and approving, disapproving, and requiring applications, and for making sure researchers are compliant with the regulations and they're following through on their federal-wide insurance. Only the IRB has the ability to disapprove a protocol. The IRB chair alone cannot disapprove. Individuals who work within an HRPP, Human Research Protections Program, or an IRB office do not have the ability to disapprove. It is only the IRB itself. If you're taking notes, I would triple star that one to make it extra sticky. Furthermore, your IRB has to be made up of at least 5 voting members. The IRB chair may not vote. Triple star that one. You need to have a wide range of diversity across race, gender, cultural, sensitivity to community attitudes and backgrounds. Furthermore, you need at least one scientist, one non-scientist, at least one healthcare professional, and at least one member from the community. And it's important that person and their immediate family can have no employment or contractual ties with the institution. If you're going to be reviewing research involving vulnerable populations, you need to have at least one person who has knowledge and experience about that particular category if it's regularly reviewed. Otherwise, you're expected to invite experts to come in and provide more information. And then finally, members may not participate in a review if they have conflict of interest. They have to declare it at the front and then excuse themselves. So, what questions do you have so far about membership, about the different organizations and their membership? Otherwise, let's do another temperature check. 1 to 10 on that section. How are you feeling? 1, you're overwhelmed. 10, you're feeling great. Okay, so we got a question. Who selects the members and how are members selected? So it is up to the institution to select the members. For most of the time, you have individuals who go ahead and approach the IRB itself and say, we're interested in becoming a member. Otherwise, people look for who has really good track record compliance and is doing a wide variety of research, as well as looking sure to help keep diversity within the group. Usually it's your IRB administrator or your HRP director talks with the IRB chair. This sounds like a good candidate. They approach for interest. That individual then goes through a fair amount of training before joining the board. Another question we have is IRB people by the university, or is it like a community member where it's voluntary? That can vary from institution to institution. Most of the time, though, it is purely voluntary. Now, you have what is called commercial IRBs. And like, for instance, Virginia Tech has a partial contract with commercial IRB. So if we get research that we don't feel we have the expertise for, we can send it to the commercial IRB, and we're paying them to review it. So they are receiving payment. It is their employment. But most institutions, it's voluntary. So for those who got a 7 or lower on your comfort level, I recommend spending a little more time with those slides, especially the makeup of the committee and regarding the IRB chair. Now, let's go ahead and talk about when is IRB approval needed and the different approval categories. So your federal-wide insurance is renewed every 3 years. And at the bare minimum, as we've mentioned earlier, you have to go ahead and require IRB approval when there's federal funding. However, the federal-wide insurance can cause an entity to have to apply the regulations to everyone, regardless of funding source. So it varies from institution to institution. When looking at that, we have to define what is human subjects and what is research. So here are the federal definitions. First is research has to be a systematic investigation. And this includes development, testing, and evaluation with the intent to develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge. So would quality improvement classify as research? What do you think? Give me a yes or a no. I'm curious of what people think. Okay, we have a few yeses, some more no's. It would actually not classify as research. The reason why is that its intent is not to create generalizable knowledge. It is just focused on improving the program. What about case studies? If you're looking at a single individual, would that meet the definition of research? Okay, we have some no's, some yeses. So it actually would not. If it's a single case study where it's looking at one or maybe even two people, it would not necessarily be able to be classified as generalizable knowledge. It's still publishable, but it may not be applicable to 45 CFR 46 under its revised state. So a lot of institutions have something called a determination process, where if you are not sure if something meets the definition of research or human subject, you can contact your IRB office or your HRPP. And like for Virginia Tech, we have a form that you fill out and we'll get back to you in writing whether something actually meets the definition or not. So, okay. What if someone is interviewing 10 people and they're asking the same questions for each person? Would that meet the definition of research? Okay. So we have a lot yeses, a few nos. Provided that the intent is to create generalizable investigation. So, and if you're feeling yourself going, wait, is it not? Don't worry. Even as protocol coordinators in the office do that. So it's not uncommon for protocol coordinators to get together and discuss determinations as a group. So let's go ahead and look at the definition of human subject. This is a living individual who the investigator is seeking either information or data through intervention or interaction with them, or is obtaining, using, studying, analyzing, or generalizing identifiable private information or biospecimens. So if you are looking to do research, let's see, if I'm going to ask 10 people their preferences between two institutions in order to assess which institution is better, would that meet the definition of human subjects research? So the answer would be yes, because I'm interacting with living individuals. I'm obtaining information through them, through the interaction with them. So it would meet the definition. Say I am looking at publicly available, but you're at, the question with that though is when someone's like, but the information is not about them, you're asking about their preferences. So that is actually about them, if it's their preferences or opinions. Now, Anna actually brings up a really good point here. What if you are asking those 10 people to, they all are business owners, and you're asking them about their company's practices? Then that case, it would not be human subjects research. It would still be research. It's a systematic investigation. But because it doesn't meet the definition of human subjects, it's not applicable. So Jody asked the question of what if, or we also have the question of what if it's an online survey that's anonymous? So it's an either or on these two bullets underneath. So if you're still obtaining information through them for an interaction, so it would be human subjects research. However, because it's anonymous, you're going to find out in a few seconds that the exempt CAT 2I deals with anonymous surveys. So if you are looking, if you're either interacting with them to obtain information, or you are dealing with dealing with identifiable data, then you are dealing with human subjects research. Now, if you are looking at coded data that's de-identified, you're not engaged. It doesn't meet the definition. So when you're looking at secondary analysis, you're going to want to talk with your local HRPP or your IRB. Yep, exactly, Anna. That is correct, because you are doing a survey. Now, if that school is doing a survey in order to improve their program or to evaluate their current program, then it's quality assurance. But even then, when you're looking at quality assurance, quality improvement and such, the determination according to the regulation cannot be made by the researchers. It must be made by a third party. Okay, and the question on that case, sure, Stace, be happy to. The question on that case is if an elementary school is doing an anonymous survey for parents, would they still need IRB approval? And thank you for letting me know, Stacy. So now let's talk about the different types of review. we have 3 categories. We have exempt, expedited, and full board. So exempt is the lowest risk research. It may not involve pregnant women or prisoners, individuals who are mentally impaired, or minors in survey research unless it's part of a standard practice within the school during daily school life. And here are the categories. And so you've heard me say it before, we have exempt, and then I use Cat 2I, non-identifiable tests, surveys, interviews, and observations that you are collecting. So we have exempt Cat 1, educational settings. This is where you are looking at regular school practices that are taking place during these school hours. Cat 2I cannot include minors. It is for adults only, and that includes non-identifiable tests, surveys, interviews, or observations. 2II is low risk. 2III, now we have the implementation of something new because of the revised common rule, and that is what's called limited review. So all these exempt categories, with the exception of 2II and 3IB or IC, all those can be reviewed by a designated member within the IRB office or the HRPP. It doesn't require an IRB member to review it under limited review. And that's 2III and 3IC. And that's because there is a risk of legal or privacy. If you are dealing with any other type of risk, like emotional risk, it has to be reviewed under expedited. It cannot be reviewed under exempt, even if it's a online survey. And a case of that would be you're dealing with an online survey that is looking at the emotional trauma of relational aggression. Because there's an emotional risk with that type of survey, it would actually have to be reviewed under expedited Cat 7. Now, if you were just looking at a survey that was just dealing with how people are handling the stress of COVID, that could be fall under Cat 2II, depending on the questions. So category 3 deals with interventions. Interventions have to be short. So if you are looking at, so an example of a short intervention is, say I went ahead and asked you what your preferences were about a particular green tea, and then I gave you a bunch of information about green tea and its health benefits, and then I administered another survey in the same sitting. Anything beyond the same sitting, it's not considered short, and therefore it has to be reviewed under expedited. 4 is dealing with existing data. And the other ones you see a lot less. So taste and food quality control, dealing with storage or maintenance of data specimens. So your most common ones are Cats 1 through 4. So I'm going to pose a research scenario, and I want you to tell me what you think it is. Which category you think it is. I want to do an online survey that is de-identified and there is no risk above minimum everyday life. What category do you think that would be? Okay, very good. What if, for those who put 2I, you are absolutely correct. What if I wanted to do an interview with audio recordings with an adult. Questions are pretty benign though. What cat would that be? Okay. For those who put 2II, you are absolutely correct. Now, say I wanted to go ahead and do a survey that I'm asking some pretty serious questions that if it confidentially got broken, it could really impact someone legally. What cat should that be? Okay, so the answer for that would actually be 2III. The reason why it's not, your people who honed in on its limited review, you're absolutely correct. For those who are asking or putting 31C, the reason why it's not benign behavioral intervention is that it's not a natural intervention. Intervention is when you are looking at something, altering, and then looking again at the same person. So that's where that difference lies. What if I wanted to interview minors? Could I do that under the exempt categories? Okay. So the answer to that would be no. You can't review it. You cannot interview them under exempt. You can do it under expedited with parental permission and assent from the minor. Well, an interview is different than a standardized test, though. A test would be considered to be a questionnaire. Interview is when I'm asking someone directly, though, what a question is. We're giving them a list of questions and we're having a conversation. So those are exempts. Let's move on to expedited. Here needs to be minimum risk, must not involve pregnant women, prisoners, or mentally impaired individuals, and fit into one of the categories. So most of your people's research that we had just been describing, like when we were wanting to interview with minors, that would be following under 7A, behavioral research. So let's see. Drug studies and device studies, you're starting to get into a little bit of FDA territory there, which is outside, well, IRB works with the FDA regs. Non-invasive biospecimens and non-invasive procedures. Okay, so an example of a non-invasive procedure is anything that involves someone having to wear something on their body. So if you use virtual reality software like a Vive or an Oculus Rift, that would be an example of Cat 4 under expedited. Expedited 6 deals with voice, video, and digital image recordings. So if you are doing an interview with audio recordings, it would actually be 7A and 6. You can have multiple categories. That's perfectly fine. Cat 8 and Cat 9 are actually looking more at full board. So you can actually have a protocol start off in one category, like full board, and then switch back down to expedited. Amy, I have heard mixed reviews in the past on that one. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, from what I've heard back on feedback. And honestly, if once you all take your test, you'll have my contact information. Feel free to let me know how well the presentation prepared you and if there's any other areas that I should focus on, because I take that feedback and I incorporate it into next year's presentations and such. And the question being asked is, will they be given the type of questions I'm asking on the exam, where people need to state what category of study would fall under. Go back. So full board. These are studies involving greater than minimum risk, involves vulnerable populations, has to be reviewed by a quorum of committee members, and votes need a majority. And the biggie thing to remember here is that the IRB has the ability to approve, contingently approve of modifications, table and require modifications, and disapprove. So let's break off what those different are. So approval is when the IRB says you're good to go. Contingently approve of modification means you're on the right track, but there's some changes that need to occur before they can say, yes, you're okay. So if you make those changes, relatively minor, it will come back. It doesn't necessarily have to go back to the committee board. The IRB member itself can be designated to review it and say, yes, changes have been made, you're good to go. Tabled is often where the IRB did not just have a chance to really look at it, they had too full of an agenda. Table and require modifications is where they've looked at it, they're going to need to look at it again, but here's some changes you can make in the meantime. And then disapprove is a flat no. And it's not uncommon for institutions to say, if you disapprove of something, that there needs to be a waiting time before you resubmit that particular protocol back. And then the last part we have is the review process. So each IRB has their own style of reviewing, but there are 8 criteria that are required for IRB approval. Criteria number 1, risks have to be minimized. Number 2, risks have to be reasonable in relation to anticipated benefits. And this should be bringing back some of those earlier regulations in your mind. Selection of risks have to be equitable. It's justice. 4, informed consent has to be sought from each prospective subject or their legally authorized representative. So in the case where we are looking at minors, you can't obtain consent from a minor. You can only obtain their assent. And most of the time, you're going to have to obtain parental permission from at least one, if not both guardians, if there are 2 guardians present. Informed consent has to be documented. There have to be appropriate steps for monitoring collected data when it's collected, adequate provisions to protect people, and you have to go ahead and keep a special eye on the vulnerable populations. So we got the question of what is the best way to differentiate in our mind the differences between the categories, except for vulnerable populations, inclusion, and exclusion. Are you referring to categories of exempt, expedite, and full board? Okay, so a good way to review it is exempt from some parts of 45 CFR. For instance, you don't have to do key information. You don't have to use the full consent form. And many institutions actually don't require you to get written documentation of consent for exempt studies. You have to provide an information sheet. So a way to look at it in your mind, or at least that helps me when I'm reviewing, is if it is minors and it's not taking place in the school, it's going over to expedited. If it's during school hours, then it's the only time it can go under exempt Cat 1. Most of your research dealing with adults, especially if you're a social behavioral institution, is likely going to fall under exempt Cat 2 and Cat 3. It's usually very low risk stuff. Now, if you're dealing with things that are more risky, where you're looking at things that might cause emotional harm, psychological harm, legal, privacy, physical harm, then we're starting to get into categories where it might be either exempt or not exempt, sorry, expedited or full board. So yeah, exempt. The only time you're going to see exempt with harm is legal and privacy under limited review. Otherwise, it's no more than minimum risk. Expedited, that's where most of your risk is going to be. That's still no more really than too much risk. And then full board is everything else. And if you need me to say that better, please let me know because I'm happy to. Or if that was good. Okay. I know it's a lot that I'm throwing now at you. Okay. So comfort level in that last section that we just did, 1 to 10. How are you all feeling on your comfort level? Okay. Okay. And what questions do you have on that section or any of the sections? Or is there anything that you would like clarified? Okay, some sample questions to go over the exempt categories for clarity. Sure. Let's do that. Let's go back to the exempt cat. So example of, are you asking like for example questions regarding something that would fall under each of those categories? And then what would push it over to expedited? Okay. So an example of that would be for 2I, you would have something that is completely de-identified. So no collection of IP address, name, email, any kind of like zip code, anything like that. For low risk, I'm asking you, do you prefer water versus orange juice? And for 2III, I'm asking you questions that what you think about your boss. In an identifiable manner, I'm collecting your name. If I am asking you questions about like, that would fall under expedited. Stacy, does that help? And we have another question on if each university agrees to its own federal-wide insurance. So there's some variance in the federal-wide insurance. Yes, you have two boxes you can pick. You can say that you are going to have everything, regardless of its funding source, subject to the common rule, or you can say that you're only going to apply federally funded protocols to the common rule. Now, that won't stop institutions from having their own policies internally, saying that while the federal insurance says only federally funded will be applied to the common rule, internally they may come to a decision of they're still going to make everyone else follow the same regulations. The difference between that is less reporting needs to be made to OHARP. And Jody, please let me know if I could say that more clearly, please. Okay, so it is now 3 o'clock and I'm going to stop presenting and I'm going to allow my colleague Stephanie to talk about the iCook.
And the director of the Animal Care and Use Program here at Virginia Tech. I've actually will be coming up to my 10-year anniversary in January, which I realized today as I was preparing for this. Didn't realize a decade almost had gone by. So I'm going to start off with just a little bit of the history of animal research, and you'll notice I will go over specific areas on the slides that will have asterisks. Those are, the asterisks represent answers to questions that I have been told during previous exams have been asked. So pay special attention to any item that has an asterisk beside it. And if you take your exam this year or in the future, and there are additional questions, or maybe these questions helped you, I would love that feedback to improve my presentation for you. So a little on the history. So I believe that Andrea might have gone over this before during her human side of the presentation, but the man's association with animals changed with the advancement of science and the atrocities of World War II, specifically the Nuremberg Code. And this was the first time that any sort of written regulation, policy, thought had come up about even consideration of any kind of regulating animal use in research. And then it wasn't until the 50s and early 60s where there were many rumors that were happening that dogs and cats were being essentially stolen for research. At that time, they also had scientists that came from different facets, the government, the private sector, that decided to write their own sort of set of guidelines. And that was called the Guide for the Laboratory Animal Facilities and Care. This was all voluntary. It was self-regulations by the institutions and the individuals, though most of the institutions at that time decided not to subject themselves to a different, to any sort of regulations. However, due to those 50s and 60s thefts and rumors of thefts, Life magazine looked into it a little bit further. And in 1966, they published this article. The first page, or the original page, said "Your dog is in cruel danger." And then when you opened up the magazine, this is the picture that you saw, saying concentration camps for dogs. I don't think I have yet. And in this article, it discussed the fact that they found these dogs in these kinds of conditions where they were emaciated. They found where in rooms there would be multiple species where you had prey predators within the same space. At that time as well, they didn't have all the caging systems that we currently have. Instead, they were often housed in wooden cages, stacked on top of each other. Again, different species where any sort of feces and urine could run down to the cage below. There were pictures of bowls of their feeding material for those animals where it was just rotten molded bread. And so this was the first sort of, this sort of instigated the public to start writing letters to their government to say, "You're not going to accept this, you have to do something about it." So this article here was really the catalyst towards any kind of regulation that we have today. So now going into the regulations. And Eric, for some reason, my chats have gone. So if some questions come up, please just let me know. So the first regulation that we had was in 1966, and that's when Congress passed the Laboratory Animal Welfare Act. And here we have an asterisk here. So we'll see in another slide, the Animal Welfare Act, otherwise known as the AWA or AWRA when you say Animal Welfare Act regulations. The United States Department of Agricultural Plant Health Inspection Services, otherwise known as USDA-APHIS, was responsible for drafting the AWA regulations to ensure public compliance with the act. This still holds true to today. USDA-APHIS is responsible for updating their regulations, and they're the ones that have inspectors that come out to any regulated facilities. In the original version, there are only 6 animals that were defined at that time: dogs, cats, rabbits, hamsters, guinea pigs, and non-human primates. In 1970, they amended it so that the law changed to Animal Welfare Act, where they dropped laboratory, and they also included other wild mammalian species used in research. But again, here's another asterisk. It excluded mice, rats, and birds and agricultural animals. So the ones that you would want on this asterisk is just to consider mice, rats, and birds, because the agricultural animals well, I guess you should still include, but in some situations you'll see in a second, that those are now included when they're used for, well, down here for biomedical research and teaching. So that's often one that I hear back from people that they get a little bit confused on this one. Most of the time it sounds like the question that's asked is excluding mice, rats, and birds that are purposefully bred for research, and they exclude the agricultural animals. But if they include agricultural animals, again, ones that are used for veterinary or medical teaching as of 2011 are now included. So I know that was a little bit confusing. Hope that y'all understood that. And then the animals were now covered before, during, and after use. So in response to the improper care and use of regulatory animals, again, Congress in 1985 passed a new amendment that improved standards for laboratory animals, called the Improved Standards for Laboratory Animals Act, which included the following changes. So now you were to establish standards for exercise of dogs and physiological well-being of non-human primates. So again, it's one of those things when you read that, this law was passed in 1966, but 19 years later, they're just asking us to actually create, or they just created within their regulations, these items for us to consider. The next one is set standards to minimize the pain and distress of animals, require the proper use of anesthetics, analgesics, and tranquilizers, required researchers to consider alternatives to painful procedures. And this is not an asterisk item, but this is just a highlighted item. So again, this is the first time was in 1985 that there was a requirement that each research facility established an institutional animal care and use committee, known as the IACUC, to approve, monitor all research conducted at the institution. And I always highlight this because, you know, it's 2020 now, so we've only essentially had IACUCs for 35 years. And when you look at the use of animals over time, when you're thinking back to the Nuremberg Code of 1947, you know, there's only been a short amount of time that IACUCs have been around, and that I feel like we're always still evolving and learning how to be more efficient even today. And then the last one was a requirement that each research facility provide training for scientists, animal technicians, and other personnel involved with animal care and treatment. Additionally, with that same amendment, we now had to have designated and dedicated aseptic surgery area, use of aseptic techniques, use of appropriate anesthesia, intraoperative monitoring, post-operative monitoring from anesthesia, post-operative analgesics are required, and adequate post-op care. Additionally, adequate surgery record keeping. So again, only 35 years ago were we required to even have our surgeries in an aseptic space when utilizing animals. So what does the Animal Welfare Act require? So any dealer who sells regulated animal species has to be licensed. So this means like for any of the animals that are used at your institution for research or teaching, if you're receiving Animal Welfare Act regulated species from a dealer, they have to have a license through USDA. By having that license, it ensures our institution that those individuals also have to have the same standards that we do. They also will receive unannounced facility and site inspections to ensure that those animals are humanely cared for. Registration of research institutions. So here at Virginia Tech, we are registered as a research institution since we do perform both research and teaching. Maintenance of paperwork documenting the sources of animals and their final disposition. So anytime that you are using any one of those Animal Welfare Act regulated species, we have to keep a file that shows where those animals came from, when they came here. If they came out of state lines, we have to have health certificates. And then at the end, what happened with them? Were they euthanized due to a research project, or were they adopted out? If they were adopted out, there's also very specific guidelines that we have to put in there: who adopted them, a telephone number, an address, and actually the vehicle that they left in. Appropriate identification of dogs and cats and records on individual animals. So any of those animals that come in, we have to have some way to identify them. That can be through a tattoo, that can be through some kind of collar that has a number on it. There's many different ways to identify, but you have to have some way so that if an inspector comes in and they want to match the animals that you have received, that you can go and you can easily show them that this is why this animal is this animal through some kind of identification. And all of these records must be kept on these animals for either 3 years after they pass or 3 years after the last IACUC protocol they were on. So say if they were on an IACUC protocol and they passed in the first year, you would actually keep those records until, and I didn't say it exactly right the first time, 3 years after that IACUC protocol expires. So you just keep them for the longest time. And then annual inspection of facilities and records by USDA, and only covered in animal while on the experiment. Some of the standards that are addressed through the Animal Welfare Act standards are housing, feeding, watering, shelter, ventilation, sanitization, separation of species, and provision of adequate veterinary care. You know, depending on the species, you might have some like the agricultural animals that are used in biomedical or veterinary teaching. They might be housed outdoors. And so you're looking at a pasture with a run-in shelter. You could have dogs that are housed inside. And so you're looking at kennels or runs. The main thing when you're looking at any kind of housing space is that an animal should be able to normally posture. So they should be able to stand up, sit down, lay down without having to prevent them from doing that naturally. So annually, the USDA inspects and fines can be issued. So here's one of my asterisks. So the USDA's, their fiscal year is October 1st through September 30th. And if you have a registration through USDA, you will have a yearly inspections, and these are unannounced. So it's getting less and less as time goes on because people are becoming more familiar with USDA inspections. But when I first started, I would, as soon as the USDA shows up at my office, I immediately start picking up the phone and calling all the facility managers to let them know that we're going to be headed in their direction, either that day or the next day. Usually our inspector's here for 2 days. And without fail, within about a couple days after the inspector's been there, I always get an email or a phone call that says, next time, could you give us a little bit more heads up? And I always have to say, well, you essentially just had a 5-minute delay from the heads up I was given, because these truly are unannounced. We just know that they're going to come sometime within that cycle. And again, if you're like in September and you haven't had your visit yet, then you at least know you are going to have it within the next 30 days. They also have to come during our business hours. They cannot come on weekends if we are not open for business on weekends. We did have one year where they showed up when it had snowed, and we had an early or a late start for that day. Instead of 8 o'clock, it was a 10 a.m. start. And so she sent me a text telling me she was going to be headed to my office here, but I won't be there for 2 hours. And we did not receive any negative impact from that, because again, it's only during normal business hours. And they're going to look at all the facilities where regulated animals are housed. They or used must be open for inspection, and photos may be taken. If photos are taken, we have the right to request copies of those photos so that we are aware what's going to be in their file. Because any items that they either photograph or write down, those are all foilable. They also have to see all applicable records must be made available for review, and that includes procurement and veterinary records, research records, and IACUC records. So the establishment and operation of an institutional animal care and use committee. Some of this will also be on the next slide, I believe. So we'll just go kind of here. This answers all these questions. So the mandated, this is for a really larger regulatories that we look at, and that's PHS and AWA. These are specifically for Animal Welfare Act. The PHS is slightly different. So we have a couple asterisks here. So the members of each committee must be appointed by the CEO or their designee. For us here at Virginia Tech, RIO is usually the VP of Research and Innovation. For AWA, the committee shall be composed of a chairperson and at least 2 members, so 3 total. At least one of those members must be a DVM with training or experience in lab animal science and medicine, who has direct or delegated program responsibility for activities involving animals at the research facility. And the other one must not be affiliated in any way with the facility other than as a member of the committee, and shall not be a member of the immediate family of a person who is affiliated with the facility. This person will provide representation for general community interest in the proper care and treatment of animals. So sort of like when Andrea talked about IRBs, they call this their community member. We also refer to this oftentimes as our community member, but again, they are non-affiliate. They can have a science background, but they just cannot be affiliated with the institution. And I actually find that these members are really very beneficial for an IACUC because they bring in a different perspective. Most of the time, our non-affiliates are also not scientists. And so when they're reviewing these protocols, the questions that they come up are really from a community concern of the use of those animals. And that's why those members are so important. So again, 2 asterisks on that page. Some of the mandated responsibilities. So through the IO and CEO, we must submit an annual report. Those reports will include the number of animals we used during that fiscal year and the highest paying category they were used. The deviations from the Animal Welfare Act. So say if we decided that if we're doing a metabolic study, and those animals have to be housed in kind of a smaller area because we have to ensure that we can collect all the urine and feces without it being stepped on, then that would be a deviation from the Animal Welfare Act, and we have to clearly justify the use of a metabolic cage. and the IACUC has to approve that. We also have to have a justification for Category E pain protocols. This is our highest pain level, which means that they would experience a pain that we cannot relieve. Oftentimes, these are in infectious diseases, and it can be as simple as if you get a cold and say you have a sore throat, and that might happen to the animal, but we can't relieve it because we're trying to see if a new antibiotic or treatment would work. But just by them experiencing that sore throat, that would be a pain category E. And also to submit where the animals are housed. So another one, and here's another asterisk item. We have to, every 6 months, we must review the research facilities program for the humane care and use of animals. We have to inspect all of the animal facilities, including animal study areas, prepare reports of these evaluations and submit to the IO, and make recommendations to the IO regarding any aspect of the research facilities, animal program facility, or personnel training. So essentially, every 6 months, we go through any area where an animal is housed or procedures take place. And we review all of those areas to ensure that they're appropriate for the species and that they are safe for any animal to utilize. We also look at our own program. OLA has a great checklist. It's several pages long. And we look to see, are we measuring up to what the regulatory agencies want to see from an IACUC? And if we're not, why? Do we need to look into it? Is there something that we need from our IO? Is there something financial? Do we need additional people, or do we need additional space? So those are things that, again, at least once every 6 months, we have to do that. And they usually are pretty forgiving. It's not on an exact date, but so if you perform your inspections in October, then you have to perform them in April. They give you that whole month leeway on both sides. The additional functions, another asterisk, is protocol review. So the IACUC has to review and approve or require modifications or withhold approval of any components of proposed activities related to the care and use of animals. So any use that's happening to animals, whether it's teaching, breeding, research, that has to be described in a protocol. All of those protocols come to the IACUC to review to determine if it's an appropriate use. Oops. Also, they have to review amendments, and amendments are amended to the protocol. So maybe they have 5 experiments and then they realize after doing those experiments, something else came out of it and they need to have a 6th experiment. Those amendments will come through the IACUC again for review of any kind of significant changes, or they can withhold that approval. And then here's another asterisk: an annual review of ongoing projects must be performed. So this is something, if you're taking the test now, then this right now holds true. I will just say that the regulations are changing. And so if you're going to be taking this in another 6 months, this will be different, because now they're allowing us to not have to have annual reviews, I think starting next year. But for those of you taking your test soon, annual reviews are currently required. Some additional IACUC functions is that we have to review and investigate concerns involving the care and use of animals, from public complaints received, reports of non-compliances. And we take this really seriously. We have a way that they can report anonymously if they do not want to be known. And someone within our office will go out and see what's going on and then report back to the IACUC to determine if there's not a non-compliance, or, if someone just saw something differently. We had someone complain one time here on campus that they thought our dairy cows had too much mud on them. And so we went and we checked to see what was happening. And it was right during a time where we'd had 2 weeks of worth of rain. And so when you went to look, probably 97% of the pasture was perfect. But right up there, about the 3% around the water and the feeders had accumulated some mud from those 2 weeks. I mean, it literally almost rained for 2 weeks straight. But they weren't stuck in mud, but they would get in mud to go eat and drink, and then they would come back out to the dry. So we checked those animals. They had no health conditions. The person reported it anonymously, but we did make sure that those animals were being taken care of. Additionally, the IACUC may suspend an activity if it determines that the activity is not in accordance with the description provided by the PI and approved by the committee. You can only suspend a protocol at a convened meeting. It can't just be one member's decision. It has to be at a convened meeting with a quorum of members to make that decision on whether or not a protocol will be suspended. And Eric, are there any questions on chat right now, or am I still good to go?
Couple of questions so far. Going back a little bit, and I'm guessing on the context here, but would an alumni count as a community member, or would they have a conflict of interest?
That's a really good question. I just had this pop up, and every time I go back and I'm actually going to be calling Ola this week about that, because finding a community member in a university town that's not affiliated with the university is really difficult. But every time that I have contacted previously, they have always said an alumni would be considered an affiliate because they graduated from the institution. But I always ask every time just to see that maybe one day they'll change their mind on that. Any other questions?
Do we have term limits on committee members?
So there is no regulation that requires a term limit. Here at Virginia Tech, our each term is for 3 years. And our IO reviews to see if those members are kind of participating on the IACUC in a healthy way towards our governance of how we request them to participate. And we do not have a limit. One of the reasons is we've talked about limits, but we don't expect our members to know all the regulations. That's what my office is for, to really help them know those regulations and answer those questions when they're not sure. And the first year of being on the committee is really getting your feet wet, trying to understand the regulations, trying to navigate your way through different types of research that's happening, especially like if you yourself, maybe you only do ag research and now you're learning all about veterinary research or engineering research. And so the first year is really learning. Then my members even say this too, that by the 3rd year, they're really getting their stride. They really feel like they know what they're talking about. And so, you to at least have 2 terms so that then at least you get the next 3 years that they feel comfortable in being able to provide a voice. We just found that because it takes so long for them to get comfortable, we do not do terms. So there's no regulation for a term, long story short, but there are some institutions that do put limits.
Okay, and one final.
Any other questions?
One more before we keep going. Are the IACUC protocols only valid for 1 year, question mark?
So I think that will come up in a slide maybe towards the end that gives a sort of an overview, but IACUCs are good for 3 years. And it's so like if I approve it today on October 7th, 2020, that protocol is good until October 6th, 2023. I have actually had individuals ask me, could I extend it for 2 months because it's still within the same year? But it truly is 3 years. There's no extension past that date. And I have heard of some institutions making a determination to again, you can't go past 3 years because that's by regulations. But I have heard of in some institutions having it less. But again, that's an institution decision. By regulations, they allow 3 years. All right, so I'll keep going here. So again, some of our, what I talked about a little bit, the protocol review, just some of the items that they're looking for is to look at the species they're using, the approximate numbers, the rationale, is it appropriate for the use of those animals? A complete description of the use of the animals. And what I always say to individuals that are writing protocols for the first time is that the IACUC wants to see a timeline that clearly shows from the first time that that animal arrives on campus, what happens with that animal, and on the last day, what's the final disposition on the animal. So they really want to understand that animal's experience so that they can determine if it's appropriate for the animal. A description of the euthanasia method and a description of the procedures. And we're looking to see, did they ensure that discomfort and pain to animals is limited, unavoidable? Have they used analgesics, anesthetics, and sedation? And again, indicate inappropriate to minimize discomfort and pain. That's one of the things that IACUC is really looking to see. Have they considered if that procedure is painful? And if it is, what have they done to relieve it? And if they can't, due to if it's going to impact the data, they have to justify why. The IACUC is not going to just say, okay, that's fine. They have to provide papers to show that it will alter the data that they're looking at. The humane practice of animal maintenance and experimentation, the research or testing methods that minimize the use of animals. So they're looking to see, have you done a statistical analysis to make sure you're using the least number of animals that are required? Again, limit that pain and distress. Methods to conduct literature searches. So that's very important too. If you are performing any procedures that will have pain or distress, we require that you perform a literature search to see, are there any alternatives to that method that are less painful? And if there are, you have to tell us why you cannot use them. And also to look to make sure that they're not duplicating research. One of the questions is, if this is research that's been done previously or in a continuation, why do you have to do it again? Is this a duplication? You have to, because we don't want to be seeing the same thing happening over and over to animals. We want to make sure that this is novel. And then also methods for reporting deficiencies in animal care. This is all part of the instruction that they're required in their training. So this is where now we're going to be shifting again. So we were just talking about our Animal Welfare Act, and now we're going to be talking about the PHS policy. And so the other one was in 1966, and then they had the amendment in 1985. At the same time, Congress passed in 1985 the Health Research Extension Act. This is through OLA. This is where you're looking at your public health service policy on humane care and use of laboratory animals. This has to deal with NIH. So NIH now is directed to establish guidelines for the proper care of animals to be used in biomedical and behavioral research. This is where you're going to see a lot of the same things between Animal Welfare Act and the PHS, which is they required appropriate use of anesthetics and analgesics. They required appropriate surgical and post-operative care. They required formation and utilization of animal care and committees. The Office of Laboratory Animal Welfare is in charge of ensuring the PHS policy is followed when PHS funds are utilized for animal research. And this is the one, the big difference between PHS funded. So number one, PHS funded, or PHS means that it only relates to research that's being done that's funded by PHS funds. So NIH, NSF. And with that, it includes all vertebrate species. So in this one, this is going to include those mice, rats, birds. Everything will be included under PHS policy as long as it's funded by PHS. So some of the implementation is we require, or they require, an animal welfare assurance, which we at Virginia Tech have an assurance. And we must have one to be able to have any PHS funds go through our institution. Assurance must be submitted to the NIH OLA and approved, must fully describe our institution's program for care and use of animals. It must list our IO, IACUC chair, veterinarian, and provide qualifications of IACUC members. Must describe the procedure and that the IACUC will follow to fulfill the requirements of the policy. And here's an asterisk item. It's renewed every 5 years or earlier, depending on the expiration from OLA. So right now, the Animal Welfare Act, or for our regulations, so for USDA, we have to be re-registered every 3 years. For OLA through the PHS policy, the longest length term is 5 years. So every 5 years, we have to re-register and submit a new assurance to OLA. We have to describe in that assurance our OC Health program for personnel who work with or have frequent contact with animals. We have to indicate that the IACUC has been appointed by the CEO, just as in the Animal Welfare Act, who is our IO, and that members possess the requisite qualifications and experience. And again, we have to provide only the names and titles of those 3 individuals: IACUC chair, IO, veterinarian. The rest of the members can just be as if they're a scientist, a non-scientist, a non-affiliate. We don't have to say their name on the assurance. And so here's another asterisk item. As you recall, in the Animal Welfare Act, you only have to have a total of 3 members. For PHS, you have to have a total of 5 members. So if you are PHS assured and you have a USDA registration, more than likely you are just going to ensure that you have the 5 members, because you're going to go with the one that requires the most. And in most times, like for my institution right now, we have 15 members along with their alternates. For these 5 members, so even when you have 5, so you could have a chair that is a chair that represents number 1 and number 3. They can be a chair and they can be a scientist experienced in animal research. So that one member can serve 2 roles. Then you could still have your DVM, a non-scientist and a non-affiliate, but you still have to have 5 members. So you might get another DVM. So again, now you have 2 DVMs, a chair that represents 2 of those 5 items, and then a non-scientist and a non-affiliate. So you still have 5 members, but it doesn't have to be a 1-for-1, if that makes sense. So again, very similar to Animal Welfare Act. Every 6 months, we have to review the institution's program. We have to review the facilities. We have to prepare those reports to our IO, and we have to review concerns and complaints. We have to make recommendations to the IO regarding the program, facilities, and training. We have to, just like in the other with IACUC approvals, we have to review, approve, and require modifications of the animal protocols and significant amendments. And we have to, if we want to suspend an activity, then we have to make sure that we are at least performing that at an IACUC meeting with the quorum present. The difference is that one of the differences is the Animal Welfare Act is supported by the Animal Welfare Act regulations. That's what we call our blue book that gives us all the regulations and how to follow them and what the requirements are. For the PHS policy, they had that earlier booklet that you saw on the slide, that kind of maroon and tan. That is a very quick overview of what their requirements are. But since they didn't write down every item in detail of what their regulations are, they have adopted the guide for the care and use of laboratory animals as their guidance document, which is an asterisk item here. So this goes back to, this was the same document that in 1963, the scientist went ahead and created themselves voluntarily. And now it is actually a required document through PHS. This is sort of our guide to follow PHS policy. It has 5 chapters. This is currently now, we're in our 8th edition. They're looking to go to a 9th edition. There's talks soon, but right now we're in our 8th. And it has the key concepts, the program, environmental health, housing and management, vet care, and physical plant. So just as in the Animal Welfare Act, some of the basic information is here where they're looking at those cage sizes, social enrichment, all of these items, sanitization. I won't go through all of these, but it's very similar to the Animal Welfare Act. The difference is going to be, again, that this will now include mouse, rats, and birds. And this is specifically for PHS funded research. And just to add even more confusion, sometimes there's, if you have an agricultural animal that receives PHS funds, there is another guide out there for agricultural animals. And this book does allow us to defer to the ag guide as long as the animals need to be in a normal agricultural setting. Otherwise, there is information in here for ag animals used in biomedical settings. So some of the implementation every 12 months. So another asterisk, just like with USDA, there's a requirement for an annual report to be submitted. The difference is that they're not going to ask for our animals numbers, and they ask to see if we've had any changes in our institution program of animal care facilities, the program of care, or any changes to the membership. They want us to provide the dates that we conducted those semi-annuals, and they honestly look at these because in my first year here, I wasn't responsible for basically setting up the facility inspections. And when we sent it in, one of the facility inspections was done 7 months past the last one. So that was against what the requirements were. So we got a phone call to make sure that date was right. And they basically said, please don't make that happen again. So they're very good about at least talking you through it. And all reports must have the minority views. So during those semi-annuals, if there's an IACUC member that disagrees with our assessment of a facility or a program, we have to put that minority view in the report for OLA to review. So again, just as a few exceptions, PHS and USDA requirements are almost identical word for word. The big thing is it depends on where the funding is coming from. And USDA excludes mouse, rats, and birds purposely bred for research. The last little one is our ALAC International. This is voluntary. Some people consider this the gold standard. At one point, NIH, and I think they still do on their forms, they ask if this is an ALAC accredited facility, and many researchers feel by saying that you are at an ALAC accredited facility that it just gives a little bit more, puts you up a couple notches in your grant score. We are re-inspected every 3 years, and they are looking at best practices with emphasis on OC health. So just a couple quick overview. General protocol approval information. So as the question was asked earlier, IACUC is approved for 3 years. How can a protocol be approved? First, the protocol must be sent to the entire IACUC committee for review. It can go through a designated member review process where we have a member that reviews it, or it can come to full committee. The final options can be you can approve it with modifications, and maybe there's just a couple questions that need to be answered, or it can be disapproved, but it can only be disapproved at a convened meeting. When is an IACUC protocol required? So when a live vertebrate animal is used in teaching, breeding, or research. And requirement of federally funded project, a grant congruency with the IACUC protocol must be completed and stated on the IACUC letter before funds are released. So if you're dealing with any sort of PHS funds, NSF, that you must have somewhere on your letter that you have reviewed that grant that has been awarded with the protocol and ensured congruency. And that's usually what they're looking for to release the funds. I'm not going to go over these. These are 2 items that I've provided for if you feel the need to want to learn more. On the left side gives you all the different requirements. And then if you look across, so we have the guides. The one is the laboratory, the guide for the care and use of laboratory animals. We have our PHS policy, USDA, DOD, and VA. And underneath each one shows you within those regulations where to find that answer. If you want to dig a little deeper into the different, the differences of those regulations. Again, the IACUC membership categories is just a quick graph of what we discussed during the discussion. And some CRA questions. When is IACUC review required and what animals are covered? So again, IACUC is required for all live vertebrate animals. And the federal regulations that govern IACUC is USDA, PHS, protocol life is 3 years, and IACUC inspections are semi-annual, otherwise known as every 6 months. I think that's it. So I kind of rushed there at the end because I want to keep you all on time today. But if y'all have any additional questions, I'd be happy to answer.
Stephanie, real quick, just to make sure we get it correct. Which set of standards requires the 5 board members and which one requires 3?
Okay, so 3 is for the Animal Welfare Act. And 5 is for the PHS, so the public health policy.
Okay, Stephanie, a couple more questions. Can you clarify which animals are included and excluded, such as mice, rats, etc.?
So, so we have to divide them again. So in our PHS policy, if you receive PHS funds, all animals are included, all vertebrate animals are included because you are funded by PHS. So that's one. And then the Animal Welfare Act, they only include, let's see, dogs, cats, rabbits, guinea pigs, gerbils, hamsters, and they include agricultural animals that are used for biomedical and veterinary teaching. And they're the ones that exclude mice, rats, and birds purposely bred for research. So Animal Welfare Act is the one that excludes the mice, rats, and the birds purpose bred for research. And PHS includes everything as long as it's funded by a PHS entity like NIH, NSF.
And then one I'm really not sure on, who confirms grant congruency with protocols?
And that's a great question, and it's really going to be dependent on your institution. I have seen it done many different ways. I have seen where the Office of the Sponsors Program performs that. At our institution, it goes through my office and the Animal Care and Use Program, because we're the ones that are reviewing those protocols on a day in, day out basis. And so usually what happens is the Office of Sponsored Program sends us a notification of an award, or the PI does, awards coming down the pike that they need to add that that award to, and our office will actually review it. And the reason we've done it this way in our institution is because since our office is so familiar with animal research, it's really for us a lot easier to review that grant and compare it to the protocol to ensure that they are congruent. Not every institution is going to have someone within their office of sponsored programs that's going to be familiar with animal research. And so I think that's why, for us at least, it's come through to my office. Am I still on?
I think we're good there, Stephanie. Thank you so much.
Okay. So did I answer everyone's questions? The second to the last slide, let's see. This one. And again, if you know, you take these, if you take the exam and you have different questions that I didn't cover, please feel free to reach out to myself or Eric, and Eric can let me know. Just want to make sure that I give y'all a good overview before your exam. And everyone's welcome.